Okay. Hello, folks. Welcome. My name is Ash. I'm a member of the Firestorm Collective, and I'm really looking forward to hosting tonight's event with Bill Campbell and Bizhan Khodabandeh about their recent work together on a fictionalized retelling of the 1923 Carnegie riot titled "The Day the Klan Came to Town." For folks joining an event with us for the first time, Firestorm Books and Coffee is a 13-year-old worker-owned cooperative and radical bookstore in so-called Asheville, North Carolina, on occupied Cherokee territory. Our bookstore features a wide selection of general interest titles and political thought, highlighting queer, feminist, and anarchist voices in culture. Our entire catalog is available for purchase on our website. So if you haven't checked us out yet, I highly encourage that you do so. And I will drop links to the website in the chat. Firestorm is also an event space, but since the start of the pandemic, we transitioned to an online virtual space and will likely continue with virtual events like this through the end of the year. Today's event was also organized in collaboration with our friends at PM Press. PM Press is a radical publisher that we've been collaborating with on a series of events since the start of 2021. And we have a few more events coming up on the schedule for August. Notably, in 2 weeks, on August 19th, we're hosting author Rebecca Suber to talk about her new book, When to Talk and When to Fight, the strategic choice between dialogue and resistance. So if that's something that sounds interesting to you, make sure to follow us on social media, as well as our website's community calendar, which I will also drop links to in the chat. And thanks again to PM Press for collaborating on tonight's events. One last note, there will be some time at the end of tonight's conversation for audience Q&A. So for folks who are attending through Zoom, I'll encourage you to submit questions throughout the discussion by using the Q&A function located at the bottom of your screen. And our speakers will do their best to respond by the end of the event. Okay, great. Like I said before, tonight's event features a discussion between the author and the illustrator of the new graphic novel, The Day the Klan Came to Town, published by PM Press. For folks who haven't gotten a chance to pick up a copy yet, the book is a retelling of a 1923 Klan riot in Carnegie, Pennsylvania, in which a diversity of townspeople, Irish, African-American, Jewish, and Italian, unite in common cause to fight back against the invading Klansmen. And as I'm sure we'll hear more about tonight, there are many prescient lessons to draw from the echoes of this incident that can inform what is happening in our world today and how we choose to respond to it. So I really recommend checking it out. And it does have some heavy content in it in the form of bigotry and violence, but there's also joy and inspiration found in the characters and their relationships that I think folks would really enjoy. And joining us tonight are the author and illustrator. Bill Campbell is the author of numerous books, including Sunshine Patriots, My Booty Novel, and Bad Mothers. He is also an editor, and his latest anthology is a 2-volume collection with over 100 science fiction, fantasy, and horror stories from around the world. It is titled Sunspot Jungle, the ever-expanding universe of fantasy and science fiction. Bill lives in Washington, D.C., where he spends his time with his family and helms Rosarium Publishing. Bizhan Khodabandeh is a visual communicator who moves freely across the professional boundaries as designer, illustrator, artist, and activist. He's received numerous national and international awards for his work, which has been included in anthologies such as New Frontiers, The Many Worlds of George Takei, Sunspot Jungle, which you saw earlier, and Once Upon a Time Machine, Volume 2. Currently, he teaches full-time at Virginia Commonwealth University, at the Robertson School of Media and Culture, and freelances under the name Mended Arrow. Bill, Bizhan, thank you so much for being here tonight and taking the time to talk with us about the release of this important graphic novel. And I think I'll start with Bill to just sort of ask what was the inspiration for bringing this work into the world?
Well, first, thank you and Firestorm for having us here. It's an honor and a privilege. This is like a really funny story because it was something that wasn't on my radar, which kind of shocked me that it wasn't on my radar. Basically, this was Easter, which would have been like March 2019. My brother and I were with my mom at her house during Easter. And we were just talking about like the hidden history of Pittsburgh, like all these different things that we were never taught growing up there, mainly because of big business, like, you know, the entire city of Pittsburgh burning down because of coal ash, and like the Denora poison gas fire, where this poison gas just went through this town this one afternoon and killed 14 people and dissipated. And then my brother was like, oh yeah, like the Klan riot in Carnegie. And, you know, I'm like, that's my hometown. And like, I never heard of it, right? And it was like, when I'm 49 years old, I hear about this huge event that happened where like 30,000 Klansmen like came to my town. And it was, as I said, like it was totally hidden to me. So it was just something that kind of blew me away because I'm kind of like a dilettante history nerd, and I never heard of this. And then about a month and a half later, I was coming back from TCAF, Toronto Comic Arts Festival, and Pittsburgh's like the halfway point between there. So I was planning to crash at my mother's house, and one of the things on the route to my mother's house, like I go around Carnegie. So that night, this was like late Sunday night, it probably was around like 11 at night, maybe midnight. I was driving around Carnegie, and the main character of this book, Primo Salerno, like just popped into my head, like while I was driving around my hometown. And Primo came to me as a Bizhan's art. Like, it was like a vision in my head. And actually, oddly enough, what Bizhan came up with was kind of what was in my head. So that was pretty much how the whole thing was born. It was just like this moment of inspiration late at night on the highway. Yeah.
And then, so what happened next? How did Bizhan get involved?
Well, I mean, I probably emailed him. I don't know, messaged him.
You gave me a phone call.
Oh, I did. Okay.
Yeah. You're like, hey, I got this idea for a comic, and this is the content. And I was like, yeah, of course I want to illustrate that. But I'm glad that I did. I remained true to your vision.
No,
what you had in your head.
Yeah, it was a pleasure. But yeah, so basically, as I said, like his story kind of came into my head, and then it was just a matter of research, right? It was like, okay, so I have this character and I know this riot happened. So then, and now I have an artist for it. So now I have to actually find out what happened. so then that was a bit of a journey because there isn't much written about it. Like there's like a couple of monographs, a few chapters here and there in other books. Yeah, so there wasn't that much, and I kept going to I think I made 3 trips to the Historical Society of Carnegie to look up like old pictures and stuff like that, and just try to figure out what the town looked like and like who was where, and census data. And then we just kind of pieced together what happened as best we could. And it was kind of an interesting writing process because I just kept feeding Bizhan like pieces of the story as they came to me or as I researched them, and then we kind of stitched them together to one cohesive story. Yeah.
Yeah, well, maybe that's a great place to start, especially for viewers who maybe haven't gotten a chance to check it out yet. I know it was hot off the presses to get to our bookstore. So yeah, could you tell us a little bit about the setup for the story then? What is like the political context of 1923 and of immigration in the United States, and then also of the Ku Klux Klan?
This was the second wave of the Klan. This was after Birth of a Nation. Woodrow Wilson was like, history written in fire, the D.W. Griffith novel, movie, which took the Klan from like this dead organization to all of a sudden like swelling into the millions. And it wasn't just a Southern thing. I mean, this was a nationwide organization now. And they tried to play themselves off as a civic organization, but they were still a terrorist organization. And also, they were so popular that they were actually openly running people in the South, North, and Midwest for political office. So, in the South, it was still primarily an anti-Black organization. There were immigrants in the South, but not as many. So, Italians were targeted in the South as well, especially like Louisiana and New Orleans, places like that. But in the Northeast, it was an anti-immigrant movement, while still terrorizing Black folks as well. So in Pennsylvania, they had immigrant incidents and also Black incidents with the Klan. So basically you're looking at the Klan and it's at its height of popularity. You had huge waves of immigration that had been going on, for well over 100 years, but especially after, in the turn of the century, when you had more Italians and Jews and Eastern Europeans coming in from the 1890s on. So you had like 30 years of just massive immigration. And you just had this huge backlash to it. And, these people weren't American and they weren't white. Right? So it was very easy for the Klan to use like their anti-Black rhetoric and just kind of, tweak it a little bit to apply to these Southern and Eastern Europeans. And since this was, primarily a Protestant country, and it was very easy for them to ratchet up the anti-Catholicism too. So the anti-Semitism, anti-Catholicism, it all just went all hand in hand with white supremacy, and it all just kind of boils over. Which, a couple of years later, you do have anti-immigration laws passing, right? So this is 1923, but in 1925, 1924, you just have like strict immigration laws just closing America's borders. And like the two groups that they especially targeted at that time were Japanese and Italians. So that's sort of where that's the atmosphere that this is set in. And the thing that was interesting about Carnegie, the reason that was so appetizing for the Klan was a very small town. I like to say it's full of a bunch of European names that you can neither spell nor pronounce. And it was heavily Catholic. And so there were two Catholic churches on one street. Oddly enough, one of the Catholic churches was mine. And that was the that was like the plum or the apple on the tree for them, was like, oh, here's a small town that we can easily take over, and here's like this one section of town, Irish town, that has 2 Catholic churches on one street that we can just go in and just beat the hell out of everybody.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. So then I'm curious how, what you came up with, it ends up being a retelling, and to some extent a fictionalized retelling in terms of the character, the main character that we follow. So in what ways is it a retelling? What is fact from story here? What did the historical records tell you about what happened that day? What kind of information could you gather? And then in what ways is it a fictionalized retelling?
Okay, so as I said, there's very little written about it, but the things that were told were like the officials' actions. So we know how the Burgess, which would be the town's mayor, we know what he did. We know what the police chief did, and we know what the Klan did. And a couple of other government officials. Like, we know what they did and we know what they found. So there are things like, like the Burgess did find that a bunch of the Klansmen were in the military, were active duty military. Like, so we know those sort of things happen. But there are a bunch of things that we don't know. Like, we don't know who all participated in the riot itself. So we know that it happened in Irish Town, but we also know that, one, Carnegie is really small. Like, it's like 1 square mile. It's like a really tiny place. And we do know that all over town, like, they were blockading bridges, and we know that they were pulling up cobblestones all over the street and like ripping down fencing, like all over town. So we know that there wasn't just Irish people fighting the Klan. We know that it happened in Irish Town, but we know that the only thing that we can gather is that Irish and others like went and faced the Klan. So we don't know all who specifically were there. And that was just something that I gathered from just census data. So we're just like, and that was kind of vague because it was sort of like, we know the languages that were spoken there. And then I also know, because of census data, like, it tracked where the different Black people lived. And then so I knew that there were Black people in Irish Town and other neighborhoods that we thought were heavily segregated. And I knew from looking at old pictures that we couldn't think of these neighborhoods as homogenous. So Irish Town wasn't all Irish because the German Catholic Church was there. And right down the street was the Russian Orthodox Church, and which was right next to the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, so it's stuff like that. And then like the Protestant side of town had a Polish Catholic Church like right around the corner. So we know that in this very small place, it wasn't as segregated as we thought, that I originally imagined that it was, or like as we portrayed a lot of neighborhoods to be. So that's sort of it. And then there was a guy who was arrested, which I found out long after I'd already started writing it, but he was never convicted because nobody talked. Right. Well, I mean, that was kind of the funny thing about like his trial, because nobody participated in the riot, even though thousands of people participated in the riot. Yeah. So stuff like that. And then just for drama's sake, there are a couple things that were cut out during the riot itself, because it wouldn't make visual sense.
Yeah, and maybe we can revisit some of the characters in a little bit, but I want to pull in Bizhan and ask a little bit like what this experience and collaboration was like for you as the illustrator, as the person who is, bringing this historical event to life on the page. And I wonder for you, like, what about the story kind of what resonated with you? And also, it's impressive because you illustrate, different time periods, different places on different continents, at different periods, and people with varying racial and ethnic identities. So I was curious where you sort of drew inspiration for that and what that process was like for you.
Yeah, so some of the stuff, of course, as Bill mentioned earlier, he was feeding me a lot of information, a lot of photographs that was helping me identify like what these different cultural backgrounds of folks were potentially wearing during that specific time period, as well as the layout of, what the buildings might look like, what different districts might look like, photos of what the town looks like now, some of the bridges, where the events had actually taken place. I will say that there's a couple of hiccups. Like there's one of the churches. There's a name of a church in Pennsylvania that has the same title that isn't the correct church. So that was that threw me off, and I started drawing this church that was not the correct church. So things like that happen. But I think it was a lot of fun. It also exposed me to a lot of different cultures that I wasn't familiar with. Even, I mean, Bill was researching down to like the food that some of the immigrants might have been eating. So like no, including those types of things, even though people might not catch on it, I think that they're really, really important to make the story as authentic as possible. For myself, one of the things that I'd say that I was drawn into by the story is that the immigrants, they fight back. This isn't a victim story, and I really appreciate that the story has them kind of as the heroes and as people that stand their ground, which we don't have those kinds of stories as frequently as I would like. But yeah, I think that's about it.
Actually, I mean, one of the things that Bizhan is way too modest, and I tell them this all the time, is that one of the things that I was mildly obsessed about was well, we're both children of immigrants, so like that's one of the things that like drew me to Bijan, other than like he's a really cool dude and I love him to death. But the thing that like he is like exceedingly obsessive about getting it right. So like it kind of like spurred me on to go like, what would an old Polish woman be eating to give to like a pregnant woman? Like those are the kinds of things that other than like his style and his talent is just that kind of thing. Like he loves like getting those things right as well.
Yeah, I would, yes, I'm definitely into researching, and I feel like there's quite a few moments when I was reading the script and trying to illustrate it where I was asking questions like, so what angle are they looking at here? Part of the city are they looking at? What specific area is this right now that we're talking about? Like, what city in Italy is this? Like, and sometimes I think that those kind of questions also help flesh out the story quite a bit as far as like figuring out. Um, how we're gonna build this world, right?
Yeah. Like, because I mean, like that's part of the reason that I did go to Carnegie like 3 times was to get that right. Because, like the bridge that the Klan crosses, like that bridge is gone, but there's a bridge just like it, just a little bit over that I couldn't get to physically, but I could take pictures of. But I wanted to make sure that like he got like the best rendering of that bridge that we could possibly get. It's like stuff like that was like just fun because I don't know how many artists would actually ask that, you know.
And I'd also say, thankfully, given the technological advances that we have, unlike cartoonists in the past, I'm able to use Google Map Street View to kind of look at where things are and look at the directions of spaces. I can research a lot of old photographs of immigrants from that time period to get an idea of what kind of clothing they might be wearing, because it did vary, because you had some people that were wearing their traditional garb and you had some people that are wearing more Western garb. So it's kind of a little bit of a mix as far as like how people responded to coming to the States.
Yeah, and all this detail that you both are talking about, I think, really comes through because it is. I read it in one sitting, and like I say, it covers and expands. At parts where in Italy, at parts where in Carnegie, you're seeing both the Klan's point of view as well as the local townspeople point of view. At one point, we kind of travel to like the present, and so I feel like it, for something that feels like something that's more on the brief side in terms of an experience to sit down and read something. Visually, you're really taken to a lot of places. And as far as the main character Primo, who has probably the most extensive backstory, it was someone I felt by the end of the story familiar with.
Well, okay, so like my dad's immigration story is pretty boring, right? Like he was a smart kid and he was tapped on the shoulder like, hey, you want to go to school in the States? And he's like, okay, and he hopped on a plane, right? It's like really, but since a lot of my friends are children of immigrants, or a lot of my friends are immigrants, there's just like a lot of harrowing stories out there, right? And if you look at like Sicilian immigration, especially like in the 1890s, but even still after World War I, like, you just have like a lot of harrowing European stories. Like people came of just like the worst circumstances, which a lot of people still come here now under like the worst circumstances, right? Like you don't travel thousands of miles with the clothes on your back because you just kind of want to see what it's like on the other side of the world, right? Mm-hmm. Like you don't want to give up your life. So, it was just a story that kind of like popped in my head, but it was like a story that I really wanted to get right. Like I really wanted to tell a story that was believable and that was right. Like that's a story that wouldn't have been like that uncommon in that time period. Like, I mean, he could have been German, he could have been a Sicilian, he could have been, Slovak. I mean, he could have been anything from that time period. He could have been Russian, right? I mean, there were a lot of people fleeing at that time, which I guess is pretty much why we closed the border. And it's very similar to stories that are going on right now. And that was pretty much one of the parallels that I wanted to put in, wanted to make as explicit was that, your grandparents or great grandparents, a lot of them came under the exact same situations that people are coming in now. And then his situation is very similar to the people who are already there, right? Like if you see that there are very subtle kind of links that he has with the other people that he's fighting, alongside, even though you wouldn't necessarily think so,
Yeah, well, maybe you could share a little bit more about Primo, about the character, and what because it happened in Irish Town in Carnegie. There are African American characters, but you kind of chose to focus in on an Italian immigrant, Primo. So what was it about sort of his story in particular that made him a compelling character for you to focus on?
Well, I think that, as I said, he just kind of popped into my head. And I think it was an accident pretty much, but I think the reason that he popped into my head was, this is around the time when Trump, or after the time, I can't quite remember, when Trump was talking about getting rid of birthright citizenship. Which kind of strikes a nerve with me. I mean, my mom's American, so it wasn't anything that I would have to worry about. But at the same time, it kind of struck a little too close to home because my dad is Jamaican. I'm just like, hey, that's just anti-American. And just online, I was just debating with a bunch of people from home, and it was like a disproportionate amount of like Italian Americans I was debating with. And I already knew about how Italian immigrants were lynched in this country. Like I already knew that. But I think that in like our debates, I just kind of went down, as I said, like I'm a dilettante history nerd. So I went down like this rabbit hole of just like the Italian immigrant story in America and just found like huge amounts of discrimination and stuff. And I was just thinking like, wow, like for instance, like when the Immigration Act of 1965 that, eased up all the quotas on immigration, eased up quotas on every country in this world except for Italy. like we didn't ease up quotas on Italy until 1968, and that like took extra lobbying. Like, and Italian Americans didn't reach pay equality with other whites until the 1980s. So I'm just sitting there going like, wow, like here's this group, like a bunch of people that I went to school with or from the same area as I was, just vehemently were like anti-immigrant, anti-immigration, and like, but they were like their grandparents were just huge targets of anti-immigration. So I think like that's probably why Primo popped into my head. Was just kind of thinking along those lines. Because one of the jokes I make is like, once you're admitted into a club, you want to pretend that you're always a member. But I guess like if you're like the last one admitted, then I guess you're tasked with guarding the door. And I guess that was sort of like, so I just kind of, I guess I wanted to examine the doorman, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah, and then at the same time, there's, in Primo's backstory, there was fleeing the fascism that was happening in Spain. And I thought that the pieces that showed divisions within Primo's home country, was pretty interesting as well in terms of what, he then ends up dealing with in the United States.
Well, Sicily, just historically, Sicily is just kind of interesting because it's like a crossroads because it's like always been invaded, right? And Sicily is just this country that like Italy was kind of visited upon them, right? Like you wake up one day and you're like, you're Italian, right? And like, and they and just like the political violence that ensued, like, they fought for Italy and then were just like treated horribly for them. So, or treated horribly by them. So, as an African American, I can feel a lot of sympathy for the Sicilian story, right? And I guess that's probably another reason why I was drawn to it, because like the parallels are like so easy.
I appreciated that about the way that you built his character as well. Like just like he seemed very fleshed out and multidimensional by adding those kinds of life experiences and like, being a Alpine, troop member of the Alpine troops and like those kinds of things that make him, he's not just an immigrant, but he's an immigrant with this whole like life experience that we get, pieces of that help us understand, who he is and why he's reacting the way that he is in the story.
I think that for me, I think that thank you first. But I think that that's very important, right? Like when we talk about politics, it's always in this abstract, right? And it's like you talk about like immigrants, right? And everybody has a story, right? And people kind of other all these other people, but as I said, like people don't just pack up, and most people don't pack up and go, I'm going to just like leave my entire life and just go some thousands of miles away. So I just thought it was kind of important to give Primo and these other folks like a life and a community and just like even just those little snippets to try to fill them as much as possible, which the artist does very well with, to give those little snippets life. Just say like, you know, people come here and even if you hate them, they still have a life, right?
And I think that also from the immigrant experience too, at least from what my father has told me and from my experience growing up around him, it's like, you know, a lot of people, I feel like there's this mythos that people are coming to America because it's so much better and they don't want, you know, anything else. But, you know, it took my father a long time to be naturalized as a citizen. He was, you know, he had a green card because he still loves his country, even though it's not a great situation there, but you know, he still loves his country, loves the people there, and you know, it that doesn't change. You know, it's why people are still rocking the flags of their country while they're living in the United States as immigrants, is because there's this pride in their nationality and their heritage and their background.
No, I harassed my dad. I just kept making fun of him until he did. I don't think he became a citizen until I was in college. You know, he
Yeah,
came here before I was born. Yeah,
same,
yeah,
same. Yeah, my dad didn't until I was in college.
right. And that was just because I kept making fun of him, which you know now I take back. But you know, I was a teenager. It was like one of the few things I was allowed to make fun of him for. You know?
Yeah, so my father actually, it's funny, because he's technically an alien, he used to tell some of my cousins that he was from outer space because, you know, technically he's he's officially an alien through the documentation, and they got a kick out of that, especially, you know, given you know, science fiction being popular around that time period,
Yeah.
growing up.
Well, yeah, I'm curious to ask then, hearing sort of like both your own stories, sharing about your own ancestry, people in your life, and you know how that relates to the characters that were created. I'm curious, like what do you hope people get from this story? And I know I think there's multiple lessons that can be learned or you know, pulled out of the story. The introduction in particular sort of notes the way that a certain form of white supremacy that we thought may have been sort of banished to the periphery of society is now ascending again, has been, you know, over the last decade or so. So what lessons in particular with that do you feel like those organizing to resist and fight back against that rise can learn from this story?
Bijan,
I mean, for me, like one of the things that I do appreciate about presenting this type of history is that, you know, in the current climate, one of the things that I constantly heard from a lot of, you know, friends, you know, mostly white friends, are, you know, that this is not America, this is not America. And it's like, well, like this is America. Like this has been America for a long time. And hopefully that realization that like we have this long history of this type of behavior that's almost cyclical. There's actually a Iranian cartoonist that his book, Adishir Mohassis, he's a political cartoonist. He talks about this idea of closed circuit history, where it's like repetitive, it's cyclical. And I think that that's very true within the United States. And some of the ways that Bill has framed the story, especially with our chapter bricks, kind of points to that and points to this common thread throughout American history.
well, for me, I think that there were, well, one, I thought it was kind of interesting because usually my shtick was that, you know, I'm an artist and I don't have any answers. I just have a lot of questions. But then I thought, like, when people started asking me about this book, I was like, wow, I think ironically I came up with an answer to something, you know? One of which, one would be the question that I originally wanted to pose was, you know, we've kind of gotten to the point where even people who, you know, refuse to admit that they're racist will admit that like race is a social construct, right? And I think like this kind of illustrates, like that was one of the things that I thought was kind of interesting was, you know, kicking back the notion of race a century so that you can see that people who now view themselves as white don't realize that a century ago that they weren't. So then I was like, well, then to me, you know, what exactly are you defending, right? So I think I can't remember because, as I said, like I haven't read the afterword, but I think I brought up like Mike Ditka, right? Did I bring that up? Okay, right. So you know, one of the things that I find very fascinating, well, not fascinating, I never did like Mike Ditka, so whatever. So anyway, Ditka's from Carnegie, which a lot of people don't know. And you know, he changed his name. His dad anglicized his name. I think his original name was like Drushka or something like that. I can't remember. Anyway, so the funny thing about Ditka now is that he's very anti-immigrant, right? He's all up here like, go back home, blah, 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 you don't belong here, this is our country, etc. Well, the funny thing is that, you know, Ditka's parents were targets of the Klan in Carnegie, who the Klan was telling him they're his parents to go back home, they don't belong here, this is their country. So when I look at a lot of the people that are, you know, defending whiteness to the point of absurdity right now, you know, a lot of them 100 years ago would have been on the receiving end of those Klan clubs. And so the question is, what exactly are you fighting for? You know, what are you defending? You know, so that's one of the questions. Now, the answer that I think that I provided was sort of like the resistance part of it, right? It's like, you don't have to be on the same page, but you should be reading from the same book, right? That if they're coming for all of you, then you kind of need to put all your other things aside, at least for the moment, right? Because you have a bigger enemy in front of you. So I think that that's sort of the thing that I want people to take away from that. Like, you probably have problems large and small with potential allies, but you do have an enemy. So at this juncture, and probably for like the next 20, 30 years, don't confuse the two. You know what I mean? Don't confuse the two, because they want you to be confused. You know, it's sort of like, you know, when I think about like the histories of, you know, colonialism and, you know, slavery and all that stuff, it was like the thing that the indigenous people, the weakness that they had was like, they weren't seeing themselves through European eyes, right? You're like, I'm X, they're Y, you know, you're Z, you're J, you know, and the Europeans are like, no, you're blank, and we're just coming for all of you. You know, but the indigenous folks just didn't know that. Like, they were looking at the world in their terms, and like they just didn't realize that. So like now, this is the way that I'm looking at it, right? The Klan didn't care if dude was Slovenian and this person was black and this person was Armenian or whatever. They came to Carnegie wanting to beat them all. Like Jew, Catholic, they didn't care. It was like, they were like, y'all aren't white. I don't care what you say you are. And that's just like where we are, right? So don't confuse the two.
Yeah, it's well said. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, I just want to put in a plug for folks who are in the audience. If you do have questions that you want to direct either towards Bill or Bizhan, or both, I think now would be the time to do that. I'm sure we can keep talking a little bit. I have one other question I wanted to ask, but if folks in the audience want to submit that stuff, now would be the time to do it. But sort of on that point, connected to that last point there. So the last page of the novel, I don't want to give it. I don't want to tell people what the last page is, but there is sort of a. I'll just say a jump to the present, and I was wondering, what sort of, yeah, in connected to your last answer, your previous answer, sort of what inspired that? What was sort of what were you going for with that last page? And I know, and Bizhan here with the visuals are very striking on that last page. So sort of like, what was that like for you to sort of like end the novel with that image?
Well, I did those breaks before I illustrated the rest of the content. So it wasn't I did the rest in order. So like those things already existed. Yeah. So it wasn't as epic as it might be, but I will say that I do think that was one of the images where I'm like, okay, I really nailed that one, because there's these moments I feel like all artists have where, like, generally speaking, you see nothing but the imperfections of your work. Like that's all you see with everything, especially after you continuously get better. But there's these moments where you see something that you've done and you're like, okay, like that was exactly what it needed to be. And I feel like that's probably definitely one of those images in the book that was the case. And I will say, as far as to your last response, as far as like what you want to people to get out of it, one of the things that I find interesting, especially in the context of immigrants, is that you have immigrants that are naturalized citizens that are then criticizing immigrants that are coming to the country, and there's this need for trying to separate themselves from folks that are crossing the border, that I think that there's been a lot of panel discussions that I've listened to in the Iranian community that discuss this issue about, like, they're wanting to identify as Americans to separate themselves from these people, and it's like, what, you're also still those targets. Like, nobody sees you as that way. It's one of the reasons why, every time I introduce myself, the question's always, where are you from? And it's like, well, I was born in DC. And they're like, no, I mean, where are you from? And it's like, I was born in DC. and ultimately they want me to say that I'm not American. Like, I'm from, okay, my father's Iranian. And then they're like, oh, okay, so that's how you got here. And I was like, no, I was born here. And so yeah, I think that's an important conversation to be had, even with more recent, folks that have come to the United States.
Yeah, so it's funny because I have a friend who always used to say that when you talk about that attitude about older immigrants versus newer ones, it's just like, because it's physically easier to pull up the ladder behind you than it is to pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. And it's like yeah, that's totally true. Yeah. So as I was saying that this project was written in like a completely different fashion than I'm used to. Like, I'm used to writing things in chronological order. So yeah, like that whole those chapter breaks were originally, I think those were the first things that I gave you, weren't they?
That was the very first thing that I did.
Yeah,
That, and then the character design of Primo were basically the first two things that it.
yeah. So that was just sort of like, that was the theme that I really wanted to hammer home, because one of the anti-immigrant myths that people like to spout, is like, we're against today's immigrants because yesterday's immigrants, they fully assimilated. They were welcomed with, they came here and we just welcomed them, sort of like the MLK myth, right? Like MLK, he brought the nation together. I was like, he literally died the most hated man in America. Like, where'd you come up with this stuff? So like those chapter breaks were just like, just to bring home, like, it's like, what, talking head, same as it ever was, right? Like, America has always needed and has always hated its immigrants. Like, so those were just kind of illustrations to bring those home. And then people are like, what are you doing with those things? And then they morphed over time and became chapter breaks.
Yeah. And I think this relates well to a question that came in from one of the audience members. They first thank everyone for the fascinating dialogue. But they ask what your response to the point posed by Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz, who wrote an Indigenous people's history of the United States. Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz has a new book coming out that answers the often used phrase of nation of immigrants, with a premise that what we actually have is a nation of the colonized and the colonizers. So I guess this audience member is just looking for sort of your response to that idea and that concept.
Well, for me personally, there are two things, right? Is like, the majority of the Western Hemisphere was set up as like one big slave colony, right? Something that we just don't really want to talk about. And, we brought over millions of people to do it, and, we slaughtered millions of people to do it, right? So the whole nation of immigrants erases that, right? Like it's part of the myth that like kind of just erases like this really kind of brutal history. And one of the things that is I don't want to say infuriating, because I'm like too old to get infuriated anymore. Like I try, but then I end up taking a nap. Like, nah. But I mean, like when you think about it, right? Like if you're gonna just take like the US, right? So, like mass European immigration doesn't happen until the 1820s. So that's like 200 years of African labor before that, right? And then like the Trail of Tears happens right then too, right? So in order for mass European immigration to come, we kick all the indigenous out, and there's 200 years of labor that like built the place for you to come here in the first place, right? So I wholeheartedly agree with that, with that statement, because I mean it's erasure. Like the whole land of immigrants thing is totally erasure, because my ancestors, well, my dad, other than my dad, my other ancestors didn't immigrate here. They didn't get a ticket. Mm-hmm. Bizhan?
I think that you answered it perfectly. I don't really have anything to add. I'm also not familiar with the book, so but I will pick it up now because it sounds amazing. So
Yeah, Bill, I think you had a quote maybe you were quoting a friend in the after forward that just talked about whiteness as being erasure.
Oh, yeah, I was quoting. Yeah, Jibba Mobe Anderson. Yeah, he talks about that all the time. Yeah.
And it seems like, you're sort of saying the same thing about this nation of immigrants thing. It's like a total erasure of like the actual circumstance, what actually happened.
Yes. Well, I mean, his thing is like, for him, it's like you have like all these different European cultures that in order to become white, like you have to like erase that, right? It's sort of like my obsession with like, there used to be like, white people used to be able to dance. Like you have like all these European cultures where people danced, and then like they came over here and they became white, and now like white people lost all their rhythm. Mm-hmm. Like it's like the price you pay. I mean, I guess the paycheck is good, so maybe it's worth it. I don't know, but it's just like one of those things. So but also, yeah, it's erasing others, and it's like erasing yourself.
Yeah, I mean, as somebody who is white in America, this is very much my experience, especially over, really in the last 10 years, very much so when Black Lives Matter became a thing. There was, in wanting to participate in those movements, people would say to me, well, you have to understand who you are. You have to understand your ancestry and where you come from. And in that, I literally was able to find documentation through conversations with grandparents who their parents had immigrated from Ireland, documenting, an intentional assimilation around, oh, what's your favorite sort of meal from Ireland? I had like an interview that my older sister had done with my grandfather, in which, he says, nothing, I like hot dogs, and it's like, yeah, I grew up very much, as an American, my Irish heritage, there were glimpses of it here and there, but it wasn't by any means at the forefront. And it's something that I've had to rediscover. And in doing so, you become aware of the sort of deal of whiteness, the deal that got made. And now I'm left to contemplate, well, what was lost? There are things that there's these unearned privileges that exist, and then but there's the flip side of that, of what was lost. So I definitely appreciated both the way in which the graphic novel touched on these issues. It focused on the collaboration of all the different people in the town who needed each other to get through that moment. But what happens after the Klan leaves, and what happens down the line when there's some deals offered to this group or that group or this identity to assimilate, what does that mean for the kind of united front that is possible against these oppressing forces?
I mean, that was one of the interesting things about being in that town, like growing up there, in the 80s. It was like, like in retrospect, you kind of seeing like the end stages of that assimilation to whiteness. So like, like I still remember like the ethnic jokes and the ethnic slurs and what people used to call each other. And it's just kind of interesting to look back, those 40 years ago, and then look now, and like you would still have like these kind of things that they still exist, but not even as strongly as they did then. And you still see remnants of it, like where my mom lives in Pennsylvania. I think there's like the building of like the Croat American Club. Like there's like a building, like there's still like these vestiges of it, but I mean it's mostly gone, right? And I don't know how much you're supposed to hold on to that kind of stuff, but it is just kind of an interesting thing to see, because then it becomes like this political thing as well, right? Like making that bargain to whiteness turns like your other politics in different directions as well, right? Like all of a sudden the things that are given to you need to be denied to other people, even though you didn't earn it either, right? Like the bargain was, we'll give it to you as long as you agree to deny other people it. Right. Like we just denied you it.
And this is the cycle.
Right. And unfortunately for a bunch of us, which is, I guess, where we are now, is like there are just people who will forever be denied it. So then what happens, right? Because that devil's bargain won't be offered to a lot of us, So
well, so Juliana, who had submitted that previous question, had a part 2, and it's kind of more of a tactics, again, because I think folks haven't actually gotten a chance to pick up the novel yet. But Juliana was asking, can you describe a bit of the ways that the townspeople actually organized to fight back against the Klan?
Well, actually, that's interesting. Any way they could, like literally. I mean, they picked up, as I said, they were ripping wooden fencing. They were taking cobblestones out of the street. They were literally throwing lumps of coal. They just did whatever they could. So basically the numbers were insane. All right, so Juliana, this is what you have to understand. So Carnegie at the time was a town of 3,000 people. About half of them were Protestant and pro-Klan. The Klan organized 30,000 people to come to Carnegie. Now, the ones who, so they held this big old, they called it Carnegie Day with a K, because that's what they do. The Klan just loves their Ks. And they held this big old picnic festival on top of the hill. And at the end of the evening, they marched. Now, the numbers vary. It varies from either 2,500 to 10,000 on Irishtown, and they think that they outnumbered whoever assembled in Irishtown about 10 to 1. So basically, you're looking at 10, yeah, maybe like 10,000 people against 1,000 people on what is literally a very average run-of-the-mill street. And they were just packed in, just fighting for their lives. Yeah, because they were just like, the Klan's coming and we just have to fight, you know, tooth and nail, and almost literally, like, I think they would have pulled out their own teeth and stabbed them with the roots. Like, it was just like that desperate.
They didn't talk it out. That's for sure.
No. They weren't looking for middle ground. They weren't looking for common cause. They weren't figuring out ways to teach around critical race theory. There was nothing. There was,
yeah. beyond that.
yeah. It was just a straight up street fight. That's all it was. Yeah. Because, you know, that was, and the funny thing was that, and so the interesting thing was, like, that was the first time in Pennsylvania that people stood up to the Klan. And then the Klan tried to march, I think in Butler, was even like a bigger street melee, and the Klan lost. And then right after that, the Klan was pretty much out of Pennsylvania. Even though, oddly enough, the Protestants in Carnegie formed their own chapter the year after, in 1924. In fact, they had the plaque. Like, I saw the plaque and I took a picture of it. And I wanted to conclude it in the book, except I recognized some of the last names. So I figured that I should not do that. Yeah.
Well, yep, possibly some lessons to be drawn there in terms of how to adequately push back against some of these familiar tactics that unfortunately we are seeing in our time.
Well, here's another funny one for you. So they actually, at the Historical Society, they had the 1924 Carnegie phone book, and under secret societies, they actually had the Ku Klux Klan's phone number. So they were publicly listed under secret societies.
That's a bit ironic.
It's beautiful. Yes. Anyway, sorry, but yes,
that's good.
that was you know, that was the lesson that you learned, is sometimes you just, you can't talk about it.
Yeah, in that vein, so another audience member, Kevin, asks, your recommendation if the graphic novel is appropriate for middle school or even upper elementary school age readers.
Bizhan, you're the teacher.
I would say probably not. I'd say probably more high school.
Yeah.
You know, if anything. It's probably best, I would read it first and also decide for yourself. I know that depending on the demographic of students and whether it's a private or public school, that's also going to change what's acceptable and what's not acceptable as far as using it as an educational resource. But you could potentially certainly use excerpts.
I mean, there's a lot of violence. There are racial slurs in it. I mean,
Yeah.
it's not a feel good book, you know. I mean, it is, but not in like a Hollywood. Like I felt good.
I enjoyed them throwing bricks at the Klan and drawing them. But yeah, in that way, it's a feel-good book, but
Yeah,
not.
it's like
Yeah.
very inspirational. But I don't think that. Yeah, I wouldn't recommend it for that. Like I gave it to my daughter, but she's about to turn 14. And we talk about this kind of stuff. But I definitely wouldn't give it to like an elementary. Like the earliest I would think is like 6th grade, and that's like if like that would be a parent giving it to like their kid. Like I would not give it to like, well, as a teacher, you would somebody would get in trouble for that. Yeah.
Yeah. Well,
I even started using like slurs. I even use like old timey slurs.
yeah. I mean, I thought that was, I mean, there's like music in the book too. There's like often scenes where people are singing. There's, yeah, there's multiple languages used at different points, which I thought, yeah, it just really created an authentic feel to what was happening. At one point, yeah, when the characters turn to each other and sort of realize that they've got each other back, you know, that was my favorite part.
Yeah.
There's a lot of those moments. One of the things that I appreciate about drawing narratives when there's those kind of things, and even just like I love those moments where the characters are just, you know, hanging out and singing. And I find myself, you know, like smiling, you know, and kind of almost living in that moment while I'm illustrating it and being like, this is nice. It's like you're hanging out with, you know, my characters, you know, in the book.
Well, it's kind of interesting, right? Because I mean, it's like one of those things. Like there were certain moments where you're just like, man, I wish this were a movie, right? Because so Carnegie's in a valley, right? So the Klan was up on this, well, we call them hills, but some people might call them mountains, right? So there's like 30,000 people and it's dead of night. And you see like on the top of this mountain, it's just lit up, right? There's fireworks going on. There's like huge torches and lights. So the entire town is in this valley looking up and they know it's coming, right? And like they're just like sitting there just waiting for this thing to descend upon them. Like, and I just thought like, well, what would you do? Like, you would just sing, right? Like, you know, it's like, so, you know, it's like these Black folks and Irish and Italians, like that's what they would do, right? Like they would sing just before the shit hits the fan. Right? Like that, and like that to me was like probably like that's probably what happened, and it was probably like a beautiful moment, right?
Yeah, like I feel like a lot of folks don't realize that in some of those kind of tense environments or experiences, like people are cracking jokes, they're, you know, singing songs. It's not completely like 100% dire, you know. And when I was interviewing my family and folks that were involved in the Iranian Revolution for the Little Redfish comic I did, you know, they'd share some of those moments with me where I'm like, you're in the middle of a revolution and like that's what you guys said. It's like, yeah, you know, like, we were making these jokes and playing tricks on each other and stuff. And it's interesting that like, you know, it's not at all doom and gloom as one might think.
Yeah, well, it couldn't be, right? Because you would crack.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, maybe that's as good a place to leave it as any note of the joyous aspects of some of this resistance. Yeah, I don't know. I wanna thank both Bill and Bizhan for being here and having this conversation. I didn't know if y'all had any last sort of things you wanted to say.
Well, first, you're welcome, and thanks for having us. This was great. It's like our first time that we get to talk together about this project. Like, I loved having Bizhan with, you know, like we work together as like publisher and artist and stuff, but we haven't worked together before as like collaborators, really. So
Yeah, it was really fun. I enjoyed it.
yeah, me too. Me too. So it's great to like talk about this together, you know. And I can't wait to come down to Asheville and like visit you guys.
Yeah.
Yeah, it looked like a really cool store. I was looking up pictures online, and
Awesome.
yeah, I definitely want to come and check it out at some point. And
Yeah.
thanks again. Yeah.
Yeah, we would absolutely love to have you. For folks who are still here, I just dropped a link again to the book. And yeah, maybe sometime down the line we can get together in person and do another event in the future.
All right. Thanks.
Awesome. Thanks. Have a good night, y'all.
You too.
All right. Thank you so much.
Bye now.